In the dust-choked town of Millbrook, Missouri, 1874, cruelty was a currency everyone traded in. It was the air you breathed, the grit in your teeth. And every month, the whole town gathered for the labor auction, a place where desperate men, their farms and their futures stolen by bad luck and worse men, were sold like cattle to pay off debts they never should have had. Most folks just watched. It was part of life, like drought or winter, but not Josephine Hartwell. She stood at the back of the crowd, her belly swollen with a child that would soon be born into this broken world. In her hand, she clutched her last $5. Her last connection to the life she'd had before her husband, Thomas, was taken by consumption. On the auction block, a man named Colt Maddox stood broken and bloodied. Next to him, his little boy Noah clung to his torn shirt, his eyes wide with a terror no child should ever know. Colt had once been a proud man, owner of 300 acres of the finest grazing land in the state. Now, he was just another piece of property. The man who'd done this to them, the banker Silas Hutchkins, stood in the crowd, a smug smile playing on his lips. He was the architect of this ruin, the wolf who devoured their lives. The auctioneer started the bidding. The crowd was quiet, their faces a mix of pity and grim satisfaction that it wasn't them up there. And then a single hand went up, trembling but determined. It was Josie's. The entire town erupted in laughter. A pregnant widow on the verge of destitution herself, bidding on 2 broken souls with her last $5. It was madness. It was foolishness. But sometimes the most foolish act of kindness is just the first step toward the most extraordinary kind of justice. The morning after, the cold reality hit Josie like a slap. She stared out her cabin window at the 2 strangers sleeping in her dilapidated barn. The man, Colt, and his boy, Noah. She'd spent every last cent she had on them. Not for a week's labor, but for their freedom. Now all 3 of them were teetering on the edge of a cliff. She watched Colt, his body a canvas of bruises, carefully arranging hay bales to make a softer bed for his son. Even broken, his every move screamed of a father's love, a fierce protectiveness that hardship hadn't managed to extinguish. The boy Noah couldn't be more than 7 or 8, but his eyes held the ancient grief of a man who'd seen too much. Josie's hand went to her own belly. Her baby, her little Thomas, kicked against her ribs. It had been 6 months since her husband died, leaving her with his books, his ring, and a dream of building a school for children on the frontier. A dream that died with him. She had fled St. Louis to escape the memories, to outrun the grief. This little cabin outside Millbrook, with its leaky roof and stubborn garden, was all she had. It was independence, however fragile it might be. She wrapped her husband's old shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the crisp October air. Winter was coming, and it wouldn't care if they were ready. Colt saw her approaching and looked up, his face a mask of caution. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy. I want to thank you," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "It's been a long time since anyone showed us kindness." Noah peeked out from behind his father's leg, clutching a small object in his fist. Josie offered him a gentle smile, and he quickly hid again. But not before she saw it. A small wooden horse, carved with incredible detail, worn smooth by countless hours of anxious handling. "What's your boy's name?" she asked softly. "Noah," Colt replied, his voice softening. He doesn't talk much anymore. Not since—" His jaw tightened. "Not since we lost everything." The whispers Josie had heard in town started to make sense. Silas Hutchkins, the banker, foreclosing on ranches right before harvest. Families vanishing in the night. Men like Colt ending up on the block. "I'm Josephine Hartwell," she said. "Josie, and you don't need to thank me. What I did, it was just what any decent person would do." A flicker of surprise crossed Colt's face. "Most folks in this town would disagree with you, ma'am, Josie." She could see it then, beneath the bruises and the defeat, the shadow of the man he used to be. A proud man, a builder, a husband, a father. The auction hadn't just taken his land, it had tried to take his soul. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, sitting on an overturned crate. He was quiet for a long time. Noah, drawn by the genuine interest in her voice, crept a little closer, his wooden horse held tight like a sacred relic. Finally, Colt spoke, his words slow and heavy with memory. 300 acres of the finest grazing land in Missouri. My father claimed it in '49, built the house ourselves, dug the well by hand. His eyes drifted to a place only he could see. Sarah, my wife, she planted an orchard, apple trees that bloomed so white in the spring it looked like angels had dusted them with snow. Noah's little hand squeezed the horse tighter. These stories were his only inheritance now. We ran near 200 head of cattle, Colt went on. Good stock. Sarah kept chickens, a milk cow, a garden that got us through the winters. Noah, he was just learning to ride, had his own pony, Butterscotch. At the name of the pony, the boy's face crumpled, and Josie's heart ached. How much loss can a little boy endure before he breaks? What happened? She asked. Colt's hands clenched into fists. Drought. 2 summers back. Lost half the herd. Couldn't make the payment to Hutchkins' bank. His voice broke. Then Sarah. She took sick. Consumption. Same as your husband. We used up every penny we had trying to save her. But it was too late. He looked down at Noah, who was now leaning against his leg, a silent pillar of support. After she died, I couldn't think straight. The ranch work piled up. Bills went unpaid. That's when Hutchkins came, waving papers. He told Colt the debt was more than the land was worth, that he was foreclosing. But surely the land itself was worth more than the debt, Josie protested, though she already knew the answer. Colt gave a bitter, hollow laugh. That's what I thought. But Hutchkins had it appraised. By his own man, of course. Claimed the drought damage made it worthless. Then he made me a generous offer, to work my own land for wages. When I refused, he gestured to his bruised face. His men convinced me to reconsider. The ugly picture was now complete. It was a pattern she'd seen before, but never this raw, this brutal. Men like Hutchkins used the law like a club to beat people down and take what they wanted. How many others? She asked. How many other families has he done this to? Colt looked out at the horizon, counting ghosts. 8 that I know of for sure. The Keens, the Washingtons, the Martinez family, all good people. All lost their places the same way. Some moved on, some ended up right where you found me. Suddenly, a tiny voice broke the silence. Papa, Noah whispered, show her the horse. Both adults froze, staring at the boy. It was the first time Josie had heard him speak. Colt knelt down, his face transformed by love. You want to show Miss Josie your horse? Noah nodded, and slowly, shyly, extended his hand. The wooden horse was a masterpiece, oak, with a flowing mane and delicate legs. Even the tiny saddle was painted with care. It was a treasure, a work of profound love. It's beautiful, Josie breathed. Did your papa make it? Noah shook his head, looking to his father. His mama made it, Colt said quietly. Sarah was handy with a carving knife. This was Noah's first Christmas present. He was just 2. Tears pricked Josie's eyes. This wasn't a toy. It was a memory. It was a mother's last touch. It was everything. It's the most beautiful horse I've ever seen, she told Noah. Your mama must have loved you very much. The boy nodded gravely. Then he did something that stunned them both. He stepped closer to Josie and pointed a small finger at her belly. Baby, he asked. Yes, she whispered, a smile breaking through her tears. A baby. She guided his hand to her stomach, just as her own child gave a mighty kick. Noah's eyes went wide with wonder. For the first time, a real, genuine smile lit up his solemn face. Strong baby, he whispered. Very strong, Josie agreed. The tender moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. A single rider, approaching fast. A large man on a fine horse that was worth more than her entire cabin. Colt was instantly on his feet, placing himself in front of Josie and Noah. His body went rigid. Hutchkins, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Silas Hutchkins dismounted with the arrogance of a king, visiting his serfs. He was wealth personified, from his polished boots to his perfectly groomed mustache. But his eyes were as cold and dead as a winter lake. He tipped his hat to Josie, his courtesy dripping with poison. "Mrs. Hartwell, isn't it? I heard about your interesting purchase yesterday. Quite the charitable gesture." He made the word charity sound like a disease. "Mr. Hutchkins," Josie replied, her voice steady. "I thought I should come by," he said, his gaze sliding over Colt like he was something to be scraped off a boot. "Make sure you understand what you've gotten yourself into. These men from the auction, they're there for a reason. Poor character. Inability to meet their obligations." "From what I understand," Josie said, choosing her words with care, "Mr. Maddox lost his land due to circumstances beyond any reasonable person's control." Hutchkins' smile was a razor slash. "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken, my dear. Maddox here had every opportunity to work with me. He chose pride over practicality. Isn't that right, Maddox?" Colt's jaw worked, but he remained silent, the effort costing him dearly. "I think you should leave," Josie said, her voice like steel. Hutchkins raised an eyebrow, amused. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you're not harboring any misguided notions about fighting what's already been decided. The law is quite clear. Mr. Maddox signed papers. The consequences are simply the natural result of his choices." "The natural result of a man losing his wife and being unable to work while grieving?" Josie shot back. "Grief," Hutchkins said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper, "is a luxury not everyone can afford. Surely a woman in your condition would understand that." The threat was unmistakable. He was using her pregnancy, her deepest vulnerability, as a weapon. But instead of fear, Josie felt a hot surge of defiance. She had lost her parents, her husband, her dreams. She would be damned if she let this vulture take the first spark of purpose she'd felt in months. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Hutchkins," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But I believe I can manage my own affairs." He studied her for a long, calculating moment. "Of course. But do remember, Mrs. Hartwell, that charity can have a very high price, especially when it gets mixed up in complicated situations." With that parting shot, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a poison trail in the air. "I'm sorry," Colt said, his voice thick with shame. "I should never have let you get mixed up in this." "You didn't let me do anything," Josie said fiercely. "I made my own choice." But as she watched Hutchkins disappear, a cold dread settled in her stomach. Her simple act of kindness hadn't just saved 2 people. It had kicked a hornet's nest, and now the hornets were coming for them. 3 days later, Colt was on the roof patching the leaks when he saw a wagon coming up the road. His blood ran cold. He knew that wagon. It belonged to Pete Malloy, a man who scavenged for a living, a quiet soul with apologetic eyes who always seemed sorry for taking up space in the world. But this wasn't a social call. Colt knew it in his bones. He scrambled down the ladder, his ribs screaming in protest. "Noah," he called softly. "Come here, son." "Who?" The boy ran from the garden, where he'd been showing Josie how his wooden horse could gallop through the dying cornstalks. In just a few days, the boy's world had started to regain a little color. "What is it, Papa?" he asked, instinctively moving to his father's side. "Remember what I taught you," Colt said. "Stay close when strangers come." Pete pulled his wagon to a stop and tipped his hat to Josie. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hartwell." "Colt." His voice was heavy, the sound of a man delivering bad news. "Got something here. Something I thought you should see." He moved to the back of the wagon and pulled back a dusty canvas. Colt's breath caught in his throat. The wagon was filled with their life. Sarah's rocking chair, her sewing basket, a small table, bundles of old clothes. It was the heart of their home, ripped out and thrown on a junk pile. His face went white. Where did you get this?" "Hutchkins," Pete said, unable to meet his eyes. "He had it all stored in the warehouse behind the bank. Told me to take what I wanted and burn the rest. Said it was just clutter." Pete swallowed hard. I recognized some of Sarah's things. I couldn't let them burn. I thought you should have them back. Noah made a small, wounded sound, a mix between a gasp and a sob, and buried his face in his father's leg. In the wagon, Colt could see a small wooden box. He knew what was inside: Sarah's few pieces of jewelry and their family Bible. He had no right, Colt choked out, his voice thick with rage and grief. These weren't part of the foreclosure. These were personal. I know, Colt, I know, Pete said, shifting his weight. That's why I came. But there's something else. He reached into his coat. When I was loading this up, I found some papers. They were tucked inside that wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth. Thought they might be important. He handed Colt a worn leather portfolio. With trembling hands, Colt opened it. Inside were official-looking documents, covered in seals and signatures, papers he had never seen before. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to a white-hot, silent rage. What is it? Josie asked, moving to his side. These, Colt's voice was a low growl. These are my original mortgage papers, the real ones. He pointed a shaking finger at a number on the page. The amount I owed, it was less than half of what Hutchkins claimed. He flipped to another page. And this is a receipt for a payment I made just before Sarah got sick, a payment that would have brought my account completely current. Josie, the teacher, took the papers, her eyes scanning the legal text. Colt, she said, her voice sharp with shock. This receipt is dated 3 weeks before the foreclosure proceedings even began. If this is legitimate, Hutchkins had no legal right to take your property. He forged them, Colt said, the words like stones in his mouth. He forged new papers. He made it look like I owed more. He hid the proof of my payments. His eyes were blazing. This whole thing, the foreclosure, the auction, all of it, it was a lie. It was fraud. Noah tugged on his father's sleeve. Papa, what's fraud? Colt knelt, his hands on his son's shoulders, fighting for control. It means lying, son. It means a man told lies to steal things that didn't belong to him. Pete Malloy looked terrified. Colt, you need to be careful. Hutchkins isn't a man you cross. You start waving those papers around, you'll find yourself in a whole lot worse trouble. Worse trouble? Colt stood up, his voice ringing with newfound strength. Pete, they took my home, my land, everything Sarah and I built. They sold me like an animal. How could it possibly get worse? Josie placed a hand on his arm. Pete's right about being careful, she said. But he's wrong about staying quiet. If Hutchkins did this to you, he's done it to others. These papers don't just prove your innocence. She held up the documents. They prove his guilt. But Josie had a sudden chilling thought. What if this was a trap? What if Hutchkins let Pete find these papers? A test to see what they would do. Pete, she asked, her voice low. Was anyone else there? Did anyone see you take these? Pete shook his head. No, ma'am. Hutchkins just told me to clear the place out. He didn't seem to care what was in there. But something flickered in Pete's eyes, a shadow of a lie. And in that moment, Josie knew. This was just the beginning. These papers were a bomb, and the fuse had just been lit. That evening, the small cabin felt like a war room. Sarah's belongings were scattered around them, ghosts of a stolen life. Noah sat in his mother's rocking chair, a silent sentinel clutching his wooden horse. He rocked back and forth, a steady, rhythmic sound in the tense silence. Josie, her teacher's mind sharp and focused, had spread the documents across the table. The devil, her husband always said, was in the details. There's more, she said, her finger tracing a line on a faded map. This is the original survey of your property. Look at the boundaries. Colt leaned in closer. They don't match the foreclosure notice. Exactly, Josie said. According to this, your land extended another 40 acres to the south. It included the water access from Miller's Creek. That's right, Colt whispered, a fresh wave of anger washing over him. That creek was everything. It guaranteed water for the herd, even in the driest years. On the foreclosure papers, Josie continued, her voice grim, that land isn't included. It's listed as a separate parcel. She pulled out another document. A separate parcel that was sold 2 months ago to a Mr. Samuel Hutchkins, Jr. Silas Hutchkins's son. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He hadn't just stolen the ranch. He'd carved off the most valuable piece, the lifeblood of the land, and handed it to his own family. It was a conquest. And if he did it to Colt, he'd done it to everyone. He wasn't just a thief. He was a parasite, systematically bleeding the entire county dry, one family at a time. Noah stopped rocking. He had been listening, his small face a mask of concentration. "Papa," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Remember what Mama used to say? About bullies?" Colt turned, surprised. "What about them, son?" "She said they keep being mean until someone stands up to them," Noah said. "She said you have to be brave, even when you're scared." The simple, powerful truth, spoken from the mouth of his son, channeling the spirit of his wife, struck Colt with the force of a physical blow. Sarah had always said that. She had taught their boy to be strong, to be kind, but to never, ever be silent in the face of injustice. "Your mama was a very smart woman," Josie said gently. "And she was right." "So," Noah asked, looking from his father to Josie, his eyes full of a terrifying, beautiful hope. "Are we going to stand up to the mean man?" Colt looked at his son, then at the brave, pregnant woman who had saved them, then at the papers that screamed of corruption. For the first time since he'd buried Sarah, he felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. "Yes, son," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that startled even himself. "We're going to stand up to the mean man." He put his hand on Noah's shoulder. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do what's right, especially when you're afraid." Josie watched them, her hand on her belly. The child she carried would be born into this fight. They had to win. For him, for Noah, for everyone. "We'll need help," she said, her tone practical. Pete mentioned other families, the Keens, the Washingtons. "If we can find them, show them this proof." "You think they'll stand with us?" Colt asked. "They're all terrified of Hutchkins." "People are tired of being afraid," Josie said. "They just need to know they're not alone." As if summoned by her words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night. Not one rider this time. Several. Colt was at the window in an instant. His body went rigid. "5 men," he said, his voice a low growl. "Hutchkins's men." Josie's heart leaped into her throat. "What do we do?" From the rocking chair, Noah's small voice cut through the fear. "We stand up to the mean man." Colt looked at his son, then at Josie. He tucked the precious papers safely into a hiding spot. Then he walked to the door and threw it open before they could even knock. He would meet them on his feet. A free man, in a home that had welcomed him, with a reason to fight. The man who stepped forward was Jake Morrison, a brute with a sneer who worked as Hutchkins's lead enforcer. "Evening, Maddox," he said, his voice oozing false friendliness. "Heard you came into possession of some property that don't belong to you." "Don't know what you mean," Colt said, his body a solid wall in the doorway. "Pete Malloy gets talkative," Morrison chuckled. "Says you've been going through things that were supposed to be destroyed. Mr. Hutchkins don't take kindly to theft." The irony was so thick, Colt could have choked on it. "Pete brought me my wife's belongings," Colt said, his voice dangerously calm. "Things that had no business being in Hutchkins' warehouse. Everything on your property became bank property when you defaulted," another man, Tom Briggs, piped up nervously. That's when Josie appeared at Colt's side. Her presence was like a splash of cold water. "Personal effects are not part of property liens," she stated, her teacher's voice cutting through the tension with an unexpected authority. "Even frontier law recognizes that." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, this ain't your business. You'd be wise to step aside." "When men come to my home and make threats," Josie said, her voice like ice, "it becomes my business." From inside, Noah's voice floated out, clear as a bell. "Papa, are these the mean men?" The question, so innocent and direct, seemed to suck the air out of the confrontation. Even Morrison looked momentarily flustered. "We just want what belongs to the bank," he said, his bluster deflating slightly. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Any papers? That might have been mixed in with the other things." "What papers would those be?" Colt asked, playing dumb. Another man, a young, cruel-looking thug named Red, spoke up. "Loan documents, deeds, anything official-like." The specificity of the request was a blaring admission of guilt. Hutchkins was terrified. He knew what was in those papers. "I'm afraid I can't help you," Colt said. Morrison stepped closer, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Maddox, you don't seem to understand. You got nothing. No rights, no standing. Mr. Hutchkins is asking nicely. This is your only chance." "And if I refuse?" Colt asked. Morrison's smile was a terrifying thing. "Then we stop asking nicely." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. But beneath his own fear, Colt felt something else hardening inside him. A cold, unshakable resolve. "I appreciate Mr. Hutchkins' generosity," Colt said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "But I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Morrison's face darkened. "Final answer?" "Final answer." For a heart-stopping second, violence seemed inevitable. Then, Morrison just nodded. He looked past Colt, his cold eyes landing on Josie and her swollen belly. "Your choice," he said. "But choices have consequences. Both of you better remember that." They mounted their horses and galloped away into the darkness, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the quiet before the storm. "They'll be back," Josie whispered. "I know," Colt said. But what they didn't know was that the real danger wasn't the men who had just left. It was the secret Noah had been keeping, the one even he didn't know he had. The next day, they sought out the other families. It was a pilgrimage of ghosts. They found the Keens living in a canvas tent by the river, the father's eyes hollowed out with shame. He listened to their story, looked at the forged papers, and shook his head. "Hutchkins will destroy you," he whispered, turning away. "He'll destroy us all." It was the same with the Martinez family, who were packing their wagon to head for California. They wished them luck, but wanted no part of their fight. Fear was a poison, and Hutchkins had made sure everyone in the county had taken a lethal dose. Only one family offered a flicker of hope, the Washingtons. An elderly couple, Elijah and Martha, who had lost their small farm a year ago. They lived in a tiny room behind the town's failing blacksmith shop. Elijah was a proud man, a former soldier with ramrod posture, but his hands trembled as he held Colt's papers. "He did the same to us," Martha said, her voice thin but fierce. "Claimed we missed a payment we know we made. We had no proof." Elijah looked from Colt to Josie, his old eyes sharp. "What you're doing, it's either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish." "Maybe it's both," Josie said. Elijah nodded slowly. "We don't have much, but we're with you. What do you need?" It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. They weren't alone. That night, back in the cabin, Josie couldn't sleep. Something was bothering her about the papers. She spread them out again under the flickering lamplight. It wasn't just the forged numbers. It was something else. Her husband, Thomas, had taught her to read documents not just for what they said, but for what they didn't. He'd shown her how a clever man could hide a message in plain sight. She looked at Sarah's receipt. The signature was hers, but something was off. A few letters were pressed harder than the others. An S, an A, two H's, a V, an E. It was gibberish. Then she looked at the original survey map. There were small, almost imperceptible pinpricks in the paper. She held it up to the light. They formed a pattern, a constellation of tiny holes. Her heart began to pound. This wasn't just evidence. It was a message. Sarah Maddox hadn't just been a rancher's wife. She had been fighting back. "Colt," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. "Wake up." She showed him the letters on the receipt. SAHHVE. He shook his head, confused. "It doesn't mean anything." "Maybe not on its own," Josie said, her mind racing. But look at the map. She pointed out the pinpricks. This is a code. Sarah was trying to tell you something. Duh. They spent the next hour hunched over the table, their heads close together. They tried rearranging the letters. They tried connecting the dots on the map. Nothing made sense. Frustration mounted. The cabin felt small, claustrophobic. Then Noah, who had been woken by their whispers, padded over to the table. He looked at the strange letters. He looked at the map. Then he pointed a small finger at the wooden horse he held in his hand. Like Mama's horse, he said simply. Colt and Josie stared at him, then at the horse. On the base of the horse, so small they had never noticed it before, Sarah had carved her initials, SM. But next to them she had also carved a tiny, perfect star, a constellation. It matched the pattern of pinpricks on the map. Josie's breath caught. Colt. The letters on the receipt. They're not a word, they're a key. She grabbed a pencil and wrote them down again. SAHHVE. Then she realized her mistake. The second H was slightly different. It had a small notch at the bottom. It wasn't an H at all. It was an N. SANHVE. She rearranged them. SAVENH. Save Noah. A cold dread washed over Colt. What does that mean? Save him from what? But Josie was already looking at the horse again, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The message on the map, the message on the receipt. They weren't the treasure. They were a key pointing to the treasure. The horse, she breathed. It's in the horse. Colt took the small wooden toy from his son, his hands clumsy with fear and hope. It felt solid, a single piece of carved oak. He twisted it. Nothing. He shook it. Silence. Maybe it's a false bottom, Josie suggested. He ran his fingers over every inch of the smooth wood, and then he felt it. On the horse's belly, a tiny, almost invisible line. A seam. He pressed on it, and a small section of the wood clicked open. It was a hidden compartment, and inside, rolled into a tight, tiny scroll and wrapped in a piece of silk, was another document. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a receipt. It was a ledger. In Sarah Maddox's neat, precise handwriting, she had documented everything. Every fraudulent foreclosure, every falsified document, every piece of land Hutchkins had stolen. The names, the dates, the real amounts owed versus the forged ones. It wasn't just a record of her own family's ruin. It was a chronicle of Hutchkins's entire criminal empire, the Keens, the Washingtons, the Martinez family. A dozen other names they didn't even recognize. Sarah hadn't just been a victim. She had been an investigator. She had been building a case, piece by painstaking piece. The pinpricks on the map marked the locations of the stolen lands. The note on the receipt was a desperate final plea. And she had hidden the evidence in the one place she knew Hutchkins would never look. In her son's most precious possession. They stared at the little book, the silence in the cabin roaring in their ears. This was it. The weapon that could bring Hutchkins down. The proof that could restore a dozen stolen lives. But Sarah had also written one final chilling note on the inside cover of the ledger. He knows I know, it read. If you are reading this, I am gone. Don't trust the sheriff. Don't trust Malloy. He threatened Noah. Go to the Capitol. My cousin works for the Gazette. His name is... The rest of the page was stained. A dark, ugly blot of ink or something else. It looked like a single, dry drop of blood. The implication was horrifying. Sarah's death. It might not have been consumption at all. Suddenly, a strange smell filled the cabin. Acrid smoke. Colt looked up, his eyes wide with alarm. Something's burning! He threw open the door and was met by a wall of heat and roaring orange light. The barn was an inferno, and the flames were spreading, licking at the dry grass, racing towards the cabin. This wasn't an accident. This was an answer. Hutchkins knew they had the ledger. "Get Noah!" Colt yelled, grabbing the ledger and the other papers. Josie scooped the terrified boy into her arms. The heat was immense, the smoke choking them. The front of the cabin was already catching fire. There was no way out through the door. "The window!" Colt shouted, smashing the single pane of glass with a chair. He shoved the precious papers into a sack, threw it out, and then helped Josie and the terrified, coughing Noah through the opening. He tumbled out after them just as the roof of the cabin began to groan and sag. They scrambled away into the darkness, turning back just in time to see the roof collapse in a shower of sparks and embers, taking with it the last remnants of Josie's old life and Sarah's recovered belongings. They stood there, silhouetted against the fire, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs, a sack of damning evidence, and a half-charred dream of justice. Hutchkins had tried to silence them, he had tried to erase them, but all he had done was unleash a fire of his own, a fire that would now burn its way from Millbrook all the way to the state capitol. They were no longer victims, they were survivors, and they were coming for him. They didn't run to the sheriff. Sarah's warning echoed in their minds, "Don't trust the sheriff." Instead, they went to the one place Hutchkins wouldn't think to look for them. Elijah and Martha Washington's tiny room behind the blacksmith shop. Elijah's face was grim as he looked at their soot-stained faces and the smoldering remains of their hope. "He tried to kill you," he said, his voice a low rumble of fury. "He tried to kill the evidence," Colt corrected, clutching the sack containing the ledger. Martha tended to Josie, her hands gentle but firm. "You can't stay here," she said. "His men will tear this town apart looking for you." "Sarah said to go to the Capitol," Josie said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "She had a cousin at the Gazette." But the name was lost, smudged by that single ominous drop of blood. "The Capitol is 100 miles away," Elijah said, "and you can bet Hutchkins has men watching the roads." "Then we won't take the roads," Colt said, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "We'll go by the river. It's slower, but it's safer." Elijah nodded. "I have an old skiff hidden down by the reeds. It's not much, but it's sound. I'll pack you what food and water I can spare." Before dawn, under the cloak of a moonless sky, they slipped out of the sleeping town. 4 fugitives in the dark, a broken rancher, a pregnant teacher, a silent boy, and the ghost of a brave woman guiding them from the pages of a secret book. The journey down the river was a special kind of hell. By day, they hid in thickets of reeds, the sun beating down on them, the air thick with mosquitoes. Josie's pregnancy made every movement a struggle, but she never complained. By night, they drifted, Colt poling the small boat through the inky black water, his muscles screaming in protest. Noah, huddled between them, rarely spoke, but his eyes were constantly scanning the riverbanks, a small, silent watchman. On the 3rd night, their luck ran out. They heard the sound of horses on the trail that ran parallel to the river, voices rough and loud, Morrison's men. Colt pulled the skiff into a dense patch of overhanging willows, his heart hammering against his ribs. They held their breath, praying the darkness would hide them. The riders stopped almost directly above them. "You sure they came this way?" one man asked. "Pete Malloy said he saw them heading for the river," Morrison's voice answered. "Said the old man Washington helped them." A cold knot formed in Josie's stomach. Pete Malloy. Sarah's warning had been clear. Don't trust Malloy, the kind junk man who had brought them Sarah's things, who had found the first set of papers. It had all been a lie, a setup. He was one of Hutchkins's spies. "They won't get far," Morrison snarled. "Hutchkins wants that book. He wants them found, dead or alive. Doesn't matter which." The men rode on, their voices fading into the night. Colt, Josie, and Noah stayed hidden in the willows for another hour, the silence more terrifying than the voices had been. Their small circle of trust had been breached. The danger was not just behind them, but all around them. The next day, they reached a small, dilapidated trading post. They were out of food and fresh water. It was a risk, but they had no choice. Colt left Josie and Noah hidden in the boat and crept toward the small settlement. He bought supplies with the few coins Elijah had pressed into his hand, keeping his head down, his hat pulled low. But as he turned to leave, a voice stopped him cold. Colt Maddox. It was the town sheriff. Not Millbrook's sheriff, but the lawman from the next county over. A big man with a droopy mustache and cold, calculating eyes. He wasn't alone. 2 deputies stood with him. "Got a warrant for your arrest," the sheriff said, unfolding a piece of paper. "For arson. Burning down the Hartwell cabin." Colt stared at him in disbelief. "That's insane. Hutchins's men set that fire." "That's not what the witness says," the sheriff said with a smug smile. "Got a signed statement from a Mr. Pete Malloy. Says he saw you do it. Says you were trying to destroy evidence of your own debts. It was a perfect trap. Diabolical. Hutchins wasn't just hunting them. He was framing them, using the law itself as his weapon. Before Colt could react, the deputies had him, twisting his arms behind his back, slapping iron cuffs on his wrists. "What about the woman and the boy?" one deputy asked. "Warrants just for him," the sheriff said. "For now." He leaned in close to Colt, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "Hutchins sends his regards. He says he's looking forward to seeing you hang." Colt watched in horror as they led him away, leaving Josie and Noah alone and unprotected in a world that was closing in on them from all sides. He had failed. He had failed Sarah. He had failed Josie. He had failed his son. He was being taken back to Millbrook, back to Hutchins's town, Hutchins's jail, and Hutchins's justice. He was going home to die. Josie watched from the reeds as they dragged Colt away. The world spun, the edges of her vision going dark. For a moment she thought she would faint. Fear, cold and absolute, threatened to swallow her whole. They were alone, hunted, penniless. Her protector was in chains, being led to his own execution. She looked down at Noah. The boy wasn't crying. His face was a pale, stoic mask, but his eyes were filled with a terrifying understanding. He knew, just as she did, that this was the end of the line. But then, something inside her shifted. The same fire that had made her raise her hand at the auction, the same defiance that had made her stand up to Hutchins, roared back to life. Grief is a luxury, Hutchins had told her. He was right. She couldn't afford it. Not now. She looked at Sarah's ledger, still safe in the sack. She thought of Sarah's courage, of her desperate, brilliant plan. She thought of the baby inside her, kicking, demanding a future. Hutchins and his corrupt sheriff thought they had won. They thought that by capturing the man, they had neutralized the threat. They had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the woman. "Noah," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "We're not going to the Capitol." The boy looked up at her, confused. "The law won't help us," she said, thinking aloud. "Hutchins owns the law here. We need a different kind of weapon." Sarah's note. "My cousin works for the Gazette." The name was gone, but the clue remained. The press. The town they were in was too small, too isolated. But the next major stop on the river, a day's journey south, was the city of Cape Girardeau. It was a bustling port town. It would have a newspaper. It might even have an honest man. It was a desperate gamble, a long shot. But it was the only shot they had. She pulled the skiff from the reeds. Her body ached. Her heart was breaking, but her mind was clear as glass. "Come on, Noah," she said, helping him into the boat. "We have work to do." For the next 24 hours, she rowed. She didn't sleep, she barely ate, she just rowed, her soft hands blistering and bleeding, her back screaming in protest. Every pull of the oars was an act of defiance. Every mile they covered was a blow against Hutchins. They arrived in Cape Girardeau just after dawn, looking like specters. A ragged, pregnant woman and a silent, haunted boy. She sold the skiff for a few dollars, enough for a meal and a room for one night in the cheapest boarding house she could find. Then, with Noah's small hand in hers, she walked to the offices of the Cape Girardeau Chronicle. The editor was a man named Jacob Elias, a rumpled, ink-stained man with weary eyes who looked like he'd seen too much of the world's ugliness. He looked at Josie's disheveled appearance and was about to send her away. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through his dismissal, "I have a story for you. A story about a man named Silas Hutchins and the county he's bleeding dry." Elias sighed. "Ma'am, I get stories about corrupt bankers and land disputes every day. Not like this one, Josie said. She reached into her sack and pulled out the ledger. She opened it and laid it on his desk. This, she said, is his confession, written by a dead woman. Jacob Elias leaned forward, his weariness replaced by a flicker of intense curiosity. He picked up the ledger and began to read. The silence in the office stretched on for an hour, then 2. He didn't speak. He just read, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock, to disbelief, and finally, to cold, professional rage. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes boring into Josie's. Is this real? Every word, Josie said. And the man who can corroborate all of it is currently sitting in a jail cell in Millbrook, waiting to be hanged for a crime he didn't commit. Elias stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the bustling street below. He was quiet for a long time. This is more than a story, he said, turning back to her. This is dynamite. If what's in this book is true, it'll bring down more than just a small-town banker. It'll shake this state to its foundations. He looked at her, then at Noah. This is dangerous, ma'am. For you, for your boy. The most dangerous thing we can do right now, Josie said, her voice unwavering, is nothing. A slow smile spread across Jacob Elias's face. It was the smile of a man who had just found the story of a lifetime. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, let's go to press. 3 days later, the Cape Girardeau Chronicle hit the streets. It wasn't just a story, it was an explosion. The headline in huge, bold letters stretched across the entire front page. The Millbrook Swindle, Banker's Reign of Terror exposed by Dead Woman's Ledger. Jacob Elias had done his job well. He didn't just print excerpts from the ledger, he printed facsimiles of the pages, Sarah's neat handwriting a ghostly testament against the man who had likely killed her. He told the whole story. The forged documents, the stolen land, the rigged auctions, the intimidation, the fire, the framing of Colt Maddox. He called Hutchins the vampire of Millbrook County. The story spread like a prairie fire. It was picked up by papers in St. Louis, then Kansas City. Within a week, it was the biggest scandal in the state. The public outcry was a roar that could not be ignored. In Millbrook, Sheriff Miller tried to confiscate the papers, but it was too late. People who had been terrified into silence for years were now talking. Other families, seeing the proof in Sarah's ledger, came forward with their own stories. The dam of fear had broken. In the state capital, the governor, facing a massive political firestorm, had no choice. He dispatched a unit of state marshals to Millbrook with a direct order: investigate the allegations, secure the prisoner Colt Maddox, and restore order by any means necessary. When the marshals rode into Millbrook, it was like an occupying army. They were hard, professional men, immune to Hutchins's local influence. Their first act was to take custody of Colt, moving him from the town jail to their own secure location. Their second act was to walk into the bank and place Silas Hutchins under arrest. The town gathered in the street, watching in stunned silence as the man who had ruled their lives with an iron fist was led out in chains. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief and sputtering rage. They arrested Sheriff Miller for corruption and conspiracy. They arrested Jake Morrison and his thugs for arson and attempted murder. It seemed like the end. It seemed like justice. But as they led Hutchins past Colt, the banker turned, a venomous, triumphant sneer on his face. "You think you've won, Maddox," he hissed. "You fool. I'm just a branch. You haven't even touched the root." Colt stared at him, confused. "My son," Hutchins spat. "Samuel Jr. You think all he does is buy land? He's an aide to Senator Thompson, the senator who controls the state banking commission, the senator who signed off on every foreclosure. You didn't just uncover my work. You uncovered his." A new, more terrifying wave of cold washed over Colt. This wasn't just a county-level scam. The corruption went all the way to the top. Hutchins might fall, but his powerful protectors would crush this investigation, bury the evidence, and make sure none of them ever saw the light of day again. Hutchins laughed, a crazy, broken sound. "You're all dead. You just don't know it yet." The newspaper story was a fire, but political power was an ocean. Hutchkins was right. The senator could extinguish it all with a single command, but he underestimated the fire. And he underestimated Jacob Elias. The editor of the Chronicle, anticipating this very move, had prepared a second story. The moment he heard of Hutchkins's confession, he published it. The new headline was even bigger. Senator Thompson implicated in Millbrook swindle. State Capitol corruption exposed. The public, already whipped into a frenzy, went wild. The scandal was no longer about a crooked small-town banker. It was about rot at the very heart of the state government. The governor, seeing his own career about to be consumed by the flames, had to make a choice: protect his ally or save himself. He chose himself. Senator Thompson was forced to resign in disgrace. His aide, Samuel Hutchkins, Jr., was indicted alongside his father. The entire criminal enterprise, from the thugs on the ground to the politicians in the Capitol, came crashing down. The state invalidated every single foreclosure Hutchkins had ever processed. The stolen lands were to be returned to their rightful owners. It was over. Truly over. Spring came to Millbrook, washing the dust from the air and bringing the green back to the fields. It was a season of rebirth. The Washingtons, the Keens, the Martinez family, and a dozen others returned to their homes, their deeds held tightly in their hands. They came together, a community forged in fire and grief, to help each other rebuild. The first place they rebuilt was Colt's. Standing on the hill overlooking his 300 acres, watching his friends and neighbors raise the frame of a new house, Colt felt a peace he thought he'd never feel again. Noah, chattering away, rode a new pony, a gift from the other families, through the fields where Sarah's apple trees were just beginning to bloom. A few months later, Josie gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Thomas. The school she and her first husband had dreamed of was no longer just a dream. With funds pooled from the grateful families, a small building went up not far from Colt's new house. It was named the Hartwell Maddox School, a place of hope for all the children of the reborn county. On the day of the dedication, the whole town was there. Josie stood with Colt, holding baby Thomas, while Noah stood proudly beside them. They weren't just three survivors. They were a family. A strange, beautiful, unbreakable family, born from a single foolish act of kindness at a dusty auction. They had faced down greed and corruption, stared into the abyss of their own fear, and walked out into the light. All because one woman refused to look away, because one boy remembered his mother's words about bullies, because one man, pushed to the very edge, found the strength to stand up. Their story became a legend in that corner of Missouri, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, courage is a choice, and justice, though it may travel a long and difficult road, will always find its way home. If you were inspired by this story of courage, hope, and the incredible power of ordinary people standing together against injustice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know when the next story that could change your world is waiting right around the corner.